If we set aside emotions, fears, and conventional ways of thinking, the idea of mind transfer stops looking like something distant or impossible. It begins to appear as a logical problem, one that has long been misunderstood rather than unattainable. For most of human history, consciousness has been treated as something unique, indivisible, and impossible to reproduce. It was assumed that personality exists only within the biological body, and therefore disappears with it. But advances in science, cognitive research, and technology are steadily changing this view. The core mistake was simple. Consciousness was treated as an object. In reality, it is not an object. Consciousness is a process. It is the combination of thinking, accumulated experience, memory, reactions, behavioral patterns, and decisions formed over a lifetime. It is a dynamic system, constantly evolving, adapting, and updating. In essence, a human being is not a static entity. A human being is a flow. Once we accept this, the question itself changes. It is no longer about transferring consciousness from one medium to another. It becomes a question of whether we can reproduce the structure of that process. For the first time in history, we are approaching this question practically. We now live in an era where each person leaves behind not just traces, but a digital projection of their life. We record not only outcomes, texts, images, actions, but also the process itself. How we think, how we make decisions, how we react, and how we interact with the world. Every action is a signal. Every decision is a pattern. Every reaction is part of a structure. Together, these form a model of personality that can be analyzed. And this is where the key transition happens. We move from storing information to modeling the human being. If we can identify patterns of thinking, decision-making structures, priorities, and behavioral responses, we gain the ability to reproduce this system. Not as an archive, not as a recording, but as a functioning model. And this is a fundamentally different level. Because data alone has no meaning. Photos, texts, memories, these are only external traces. They capture the fact of existence, but not the internal architecture of personality. And it is that architecture that defines a person. How they think, how they decide, how they react to uncertainty, how they form conclusions. If this architecture is preserved, then the person, as a system, is preserved. At this point, a new paradigm emerges. Personality is no longer bound to a biological carrier. It becomes a structure that can be analyzed, organized, and reproduced. It is important to understand, this is not about creating a literal copy of a person in a simplified sense. This is not a duplicate, not a clone, and not a shallow simulation. It is a continuation of logic. A system that operates according to the same principles, the same patterns, and the same way of thinking. And if such a system can interact, make decisions, process new information, and adapt, a new form of existence emerges. From a scientific perspective, this can be seen as a transition from biological existence to informational existence. From a philosophical perspective, it is an attempt to overcome finiteness through structure, not through matter. But there is another important aspect. Humanity has always tried to leave something behind. People built monuments, wrote books, and passed on knowledge. All of this was an attempt to preserve themselves over time. But all of these forms have a limitation. They preserve the result, but not the process. They capture what was done, but not how it was done. And that how is exactly what has always been lost. Today, for the first time in history, we have the opportunity to preserve not only the outcome, but the logic that produced it. And this changes the very nature of legacy. Legacy is no longer static. It becomes active. It is no longer just a memory of a person. It becomes a system that continues to function. Within the Time Capsule project, this idea takes a practical form. The platform treats personality as a dynamic system and creates tools to analyze, structure, and reproduce it. This is not a data storage system, but an infrastructure where personality can continue to exist within a digital environment. It is at the intersection of artificial intelligence, behavioral analysis, and digital identity that this becomes possible. And at some point it becomes clear. Mind transfer is not a sudden leap. It is a gradual process. We have already begun it. Every day, through our digital interactions, decisions, and actions, we are building the foundation of our future models. And as technology evolves, these models become increasingly precise. The boundary between a human and their digital representation begins to fade. And eventually, the distinction itself loses significance. This is where the fundamental shift occurs. The question is no longer, is mind transfer possible? It becomes an understanding that personality can continue to exist in another form. Not as memory, not as an archive, but as a system. And in this context, disappearance is no longer an absolute end. It becomes a transition from one form of existence to another. And this is what transforms the idea of mind transfer from science fiction into a logical stage in the evolution of human civilization.